This wasn't originally supposed to be 35 albums.
I don't want it. I never have.
Regardless, today we are ranking debut death metal albums from the 2010s, and we're starting with Soreption and Deterioration of Minds in 2010. Absolutely love this band's latest album, but damn did they already hit the ground running with this debut. I'm always impressed by those instances where a band nails their sound pretty much fully formed right from the first record. Great mix of tech death with brutal, brain-dead grooves, chugs, and slams. The guitars and drumming are enough to twist your head off, and these syncopated growls are super catchy. Some really fantastic soloing too, like the kind of Meshuggah sounding one on Breeding Exile. Great bass work, and I love the symphonic touches on the closer. 30 minutes of perfection. Next up is Cognitive with Cognitive in 2014. I've never been the biggest fan of this band, but if you want modern death metal purely on the brutal and grimy side, this is a solid choice. No bells and whistles, just a slightly updated tech on sounds pioneered by the likes of Morbid Angel. It's fine for what it is, but with the lack of dynamics and originality, I found it to be a bit dull. There are some standout moments like the spooky solo on Worlds Beneath, Imbuing of Wrath really brings the blast beats, and alternatively, Oceanic Erosion is a nice little oasis of acoustic and strings to break things up and show the band's broader sensibilities. And again, at just over 30 minutes, it knows what it is. I'm gonna put this one at good tier.
Don't waste my motherfucking time!
Next up is Horrendous with The Chills in 2012. Now, it actually took me a while to understand what all the hype about this band was all about, but Idol became one of my favorite death metal albums of this entire decade. As far as old school death metal worship goes, Horrendous is easily at the top of the pack for me, and it's no different when it comes to the debut. They take an obvious reverence for every era of Death's discography, right down to the demented vocals, and put their own modern twist on the formula. Those giant echoing D-beats and tremolo lines are pure scream bloody gore, but they have their more progressive moments as well. Ripped to Shreds is a total rager, love the drumming on Altars, and the Eye of Madness is an epic closer. Gonna put this one at amazing. Then we have Allegaeon with Fragments of Form and Function in 2010. One of the more overtly progressive and melodically focused bands on this list, Allegaeon is another one that really get right down to business. The guitar work on this album is like an endless deluge of never-ending riffage, and yet in spite of its complexity, never manages to lose the thread on crafting deeply engaging songs that never fail to get me moving. Across the Folded Line is a great example with so many hooks amidst its torrent of technicality. Also love the kind of Gothenburg-y arch-enemy sounding riffs of Biomech. The vocals and lyrics can be a little bit hit and miss at times, but I've always been a big fan of these guys, and another one where their latest album, taking some more Opeth direction, may still be showing some of their best work off, but this one is going to fantastic. Next up is Krypts with Unending Degradation in 2013. Time for something on the more doomy and atmospheric side. Regular viewers know doom isn't exactly something I love, but as far as death doom goes, Krypts is on my short list of bands I tend to check out when new stuff comes through. They bring a very entombed left-hand path vibe to everything with the massive reverb, buzzsaw HM2 distortion, hypnotic grooves, and menacing sounding melodies. Not one of my absolute go-tos here, but if I need some mood music while I do work, this is a great choice. I'm gonna put it at great tier.
Doom.
Then we have Blood Incantation with Starspawn in 2016. Time to get a bit more atmospheric again with this spacey and at times almost psychedelic crew. Once more, we've got some doom metal seeping in, but they balance it well with the faster, more technical stuff, and the outcome is one that's entirely unique. Hidden Species is definitely my personal favorite here, going for a more progressive direction. Elements of this album also remind me of like Cynic, especially on the title track. Another one that's maybe not a personal go-to for me, but I respect it for its very, again, unique sound within this batch of albums. So I'm putting this one at amazing. Then we have Fulci with Opening the Hellgates in 2017. Now, there are plenty of death metal bands that reference horror movies, but none here worship them better than Fulci. Named for the legendary Italian director, this is death metal for true aficionados of movies like The Beyond, The Black Cat, and Zombie 2. Even if you haven't seen it, you know that scene. As for the music itself, I mean, it's kind of just Cannibal Corpse. Like, it's good, but aside from the gimmick, I don't find there to be much else to talk about, at least with this album. There are some fun moments. I like the brie-filled feeding the undead, and Gore Life has a nice groove to it. The rap on the title track is pretty shit, though. I'm gonna put this one at good tier. Then we have Fallujah with The Harvest Wombs in 2011. Now, as I was going through this list in comparison to past ones, I was only more and more impressed by just how representative these bands' early works are of their present quality. They all get better, but really most of them start out at least like 80% capacity. That's definitely not been the case for some of the other lists that I've done. Here, the high-speed, highly technical yet blissful melodic guitar work is as jaw-dropping as ever, with arguably the only major difference to their sound being the production and kind of more brutal and aggressive approach to the vocals. Cerebral hybridization in particular is a good example of just how heavy they get on this one while still maintaining their trademark guitar sound. Prison of the Mind is another standout with its schizoid alternations. They'd only get better with The Flesh Prevails, but this is already another top-notch debut. I'm putting this one at perfection. Then we have Pissgrave with Suicide Euphoria in 2015. We're getting to some albums here that came out around the same time I was actually getting the Metal Trenches website started, and man, do I remember the response to this album. True to the band name and the album art, this is some utterly disgusting, nauseating death metal that made quite a few year-end lists and is in sharp contrast to some of the glossier, proggier melodic trend that was going on around this time. And it's another one of those albums that sounds like what I'd expect to hear if I tapped into the mind of a serial killer. Just completely unhinged, tasteless, indecipherable madness. And I love it for that. I'm going to put it at amazing tier.
And what'd the other part of him think?
What her head would look like on a stick.
Next up, we have Tomb Mold with Primordial Malignity in 2017. I love how this album takes a very old school mindset and injects it with a pretty fresh take on the guitar leads. Those jangly blackened tremolo lines are so infectious and instantly caught my attention when I reviewed this for Metal Trenches, where I called it a tomb-stomping frolic through the graveyard. Tracks like Twisted Trail managed to conjure for me the same campy, fun style of horror as watching your favorite slasher film in October. Great spooky atmosphere on the final track, too. I'm going to put this one at great tier. Then we have Venom Prison with Animus in 2018. This was definitely another one of those water cooler albums that everyone was talking about when it came out. Personally, I feel like it was severely overhyped for me to the point that I couldn't even fully enjoy it at the time, but circling back to it now, it definitely goes hard, and Larissa brings a primal rage to her screams that is pretty unmatched. I also really appreciate how the guitars basically explore every sub-realm of the genre over the course of the album, from tech and grind to melodeath and brief glimmers of death doom. Every track on here is a rager, and in hindsight, I can totally see why this got as much press as it did. It certainly stood out from the pack and also started to sort of set the tone for what the 2020s would be. I'm going to put this one at fantastic. Next up is Mortuous with Through Wilderness in 2018. Mortuous definitely feel like they could have come straight out of the 90s with their doom-infused sound. I'd most closely compare to the likes of Incantation and Autopsy. The entire album feels like you're wading through a thick bog and suffocating on the stink of mildew. It's all done very effectively, but again, one, as someone who prefers his death metal to stick to the faster side, and two, feels like he's heard this all already before from the aforementioned bands. I'm personally not blown away by it. If I were to pick a highlight, Prisoner Unto Past is a great showcase of all of their best strengths. Some people love it, but as with everything on this list, it just comes down to my own personal taste. This is my list, not yours. If you want to talk about why you disagree with an album placement, let's get a conversation going down in the comments, but I'm going to put this one at good tier.
Are you gonna cry about it? Next!
Ooh, another biggie here with Artificial Brain and Labyrinth Constellation in 2014. This decade's answer to Gorguts, and in my opinion, easily one of, if not the most impressive band on this list from a technical standpoint. The drumming, guitar, and bass work on this album are absolutely insane, to the point that no human should be able to play like this. But what blows me away even more though is that while this could turn into just a jumbled mess of a dick measuring showcase, they managed to bring an almost unprecedented level of order to the chaos that makes every track incredibly engaging. Little hooks and melodies are woven into the dissonance so that each song is memorable and stands apart from the last one. No question as to where this album belongs, it's going to perfection. Then we have Gruesome with Savage Land in 2015. As if one band worshipping death wasn't enough, the 2010s actually saw the birth of two big ones. Personally, I prefer Horrendous overall, as they take the influence and do more of their own thing with it, whereas Gruesome is a straight up homage to the point that they almost turn into like a cover band. That said, there aren't that many bands doing this particular style of death metal these days, and they do it very well, like to the point that it's almost uncanny how close they come to that Leprosy era sound with this one. The songs are fun and well performed, making for a really tight album overall. It's just hard to put them much higher due to the lack of originality, even if that's kind of by design. So I'm going to put this one at great tier. Next up is Hath with Of Rot and Ruin in 2019. This New Jersey black and death metal band has been quickly rising in acclaim in the 2020s, but I've been listening ever since their debut EP, Hive, in 2015, which I called kind of a heavier take on Opeth. And while there are still elements of that on tracks like the flamenco-infused Currents, this full-length also finds them fusing that with sounds of other bands like Sluggage on the 8+ minute Rituals, and even Lamb of God's heavier moments to an extent. Very dark and ominous stuff with a focus on atmosphere, but without losing focus on the riffs. And I love how they scatter the use of acoustic guitar throughout to further broaden the dynamics on tracks like Worlds Within and Kindling. I honestly prefer this album to the new one. Overall, I'm putting it at fantastic. Next up is Beyond Creation, The Aura in 2011. The 2010s were all about the tech and prog death, with yet another big band in the genre getting their start early in the decade. More incredible performances here, and some of the craziest bass performances on this list that's honestly pretty packed with them. So many great songs, but Coexistence is the perfect single to showcase basically everything they're all about. Lots of fun pace changes and stylistic shifts, including some jazz and funk influence. Omnipresent Perception, Les Detenteurs, and The Aura are all standouts as well. Also one of the longer albums on this list at just under an hour, but they know how to keep the compositions moving along so that it never gets boring or in any way repetitious. I'm going to put this one at perfection. Next up is First Fragment with Dasein in 2016. This is one of those bands that so many people I know love, and I deeply respect them when it comes to their skill level, but I've just never been 100% in love with any of their albums. You'd think with how highly I ranked some very similar bands on this list, I'd put them at the same level, but I find the songwriting and production to be lacking in comparison. Unlike their peers, I do think that these performances have some style over substance issues where the guitar wankery sometimes supersedes the focus on making songs engaging, and that issue is made more of a problem because of the muddled bass-heavy mix, and I personally find it overstimulating and even kind of headache-inducing.
My ears are bleeding!
The vocal performance could use more polish as well. Clearly talented dudes, worthy of praise, but the package just doesn't fully come together for me, so I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but I'm putting this one at good tier. But I mean, if you're really triggered by me calling your album good, then that sounds like a you problem to me. But next up is Rivers of Nile with The Conscious Seed of Light in 2013. Another killer album on the more progressive end of the spectrum. Right from the start, Rain Eater shows off not only killer guitar work, but also some raunchy spotlights on the bass. The songwriting isn't quite as tight yet as it would get with 2018's seminal Where the Owls Know My Name, but the performances are already on point. Love the stomp of Soil and Seed, great pace changes on Mechanical Trees, that opening scream on Human Adaptation going into the blast beats is super hype, and Airless makes for a powerful, dynamic closer. Gonna put this one at amazing. Then we have Gatecreeper with Sonoran Deprivation in 2016. Another one of what I guess I'd call like the new wave of old school death metal bands. I've spoken a lot on the channel about how I tend to find these albums lower on the totem pole considering how they are sort of stylistically contrived by design. But when it comes to the top of the pack, I tend to put a lot of stock into innovation, and you're just not going to find that here. Now, having said that, I want to be clear that I still find albums like this to be very enjoyable, and this one is no different. Right down to the HM2 distortion and even the band logo, the Entombed influence is strong with this one. Buzzing distortion and head bob inducing D beats make this just a damn good time. Love that cover art too. I'm gonna put this one at great tier. I think it's just way more fun to see them live than to necessarily talk about it. But then we have Alterage with Nile in 2016. If you love Portal, you should also be listening to this equally atmospheric death metal band out of Spain. I've enjoyed pretty much every single album they've put out at a highly consistent rate, I might add, but they came raw out of the gate with this one. Their music has this sense of just tunneling endlessly into the abyss with its hypnotic, ulcerating blast beats and dissonant, droning technical guitars. In my review, I compared the sense of dread that this album induces to that of watching movies like The Shining. It's just a deep black void of misery and nihilism, and I think it is fantastic. Next up is Alkaloid with the Malkuth Grimoire in 2015. Killer progressive death metal supergroup here with seriously prolific members who have played with the likes of Hate Eternal, Triptychon, Obscura, Necrophagus, Spawn of Possession, Defeated Sanity, Aborted, God Dethroned, and more. Not to mention I'll listen to basically anything that drummer Hans Grossman is on. Dude's a beast. This album is tied for the longest on this list at an hour and 13 minutes, but not a single of it is wasted with this epic progressive journey. And this is also probably the most stylistically diverse album on this list, at times sounding more like Tool and Mastodon than death metal, and I actually like their take on the doomier tracks like Cthulhu. But the tech riffs and death growls always kick in at just the right moments, not to mention C-Value Enigma is basically tech death's answer to Van Halen's Eruption. Gonna put this one at perfection. Then we have Adversarial with All Idols Fall Before the Hammer in 2010. This album, like a few on here, you'll actually only find on Bandcamp, but man, are these guys worth it. If you love super raw blackened death metal that's heavy on the blackened, this is what you need to listen to. However, that super pingy dodgeball snare is probably going to make it or break it for a lot of listeners out there, and to be fair, it is way too loud in the original mix. But I still find a certain charm in it. I think it makes the blast beats on tracks like Thralls hit even harder. And then you also have the more atmospheric driven moments like In a Night of Endless Pain. It's a bit messy, but it has its strengths. I'd say the second album better perfects this overall formula. I'm going to put this one at good tier. Next up is Exocrine with Unreal Existence in 2015. Exocrine is potentially the most underrated band on this list that I can't recommend enough. I actually have every one of their albums except for this one on the shelf behind me. If you dig Obscura, Soreption, Beyond Creation, etc., these guys are right in that same wheelhouse. Medusa's Embrace is a solid place to start with some absolutely dizzying technical riffage, and The Last Council has some really sick drumming. The entire album, though, is really amazing, and yet somehow it's not even their best work. Like, their songwriting would only improve, and the production is admittedly a little bit weak, especially with the, again, horrible snare tone in a different way here. Unfortunately, this is another album you can basically only listen to on Bandcamp, but you can find their even stronger last three albums in all of the usual places as well. I'm going to put this one at amazing. Then we have Archspire making their debut with All Shall Align in 2011. Huge fan of this band, especially the last two albums, but this very much kind of feels like a proof of concept for what their sound would become. It was hard to even find this album to listen to it too. It almost feels like the band's trying to bury it. The production and mix are definitely messy, and the performances aren't quite there yet. Most notably, Ollie hadn't quite honed in on his trademark syncopated machine gun grunts just yet. Still, the musicianship is already pretty next level. It just needed a little bit more time to incubate. So I still think it's worth listening to this at least once. I'm going to put it at good tier. Then we have Abyssal with Denouement in 2012. Another incredibly underrated band with a discography that's highly worth your time and pretty short too. Mash up Portal and Ulcerate doom it up a little bit more, and this would more or less be the result. Songs run on the longer side and range from full-on blast beat driven assaults to eerie drone and ambience and basically everywhere in between. The resulting experience is always imposing, but traverses more introspective and existential sounding territory than that of Ultrage, despite some of the similarities in their approaches. Celestial dictatorship sounds at times like the weight of all of the world's sorrow bearing down upon you. When paradigms supplant gods, though, gets downright triumphant, and the masterful 11+ minute swan song of a dying race is about as eerie and haunting as you can get. Deeply stirring stuff, and again, not even their best album, but I'm gonna put this one at fantastic. Next up is Equipoise with Demiurgus in 2019. Another supergroup with a really fun story that primary songwriter Nick Padovani actually shared here on the channel when it came out. He was writing this album, which is based conceptually on Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and decided he would just reach out to his dream list of musicians to see if they wanted to be a part of it. In the end, he landed Hugo Doyen-Keraut of Beyond Creation on bass, Stevie Boiser of Inferi on vocals, Jimmy Pitts of NYN on keys, Chasen Westmoreland of Demon King on drums, and Sanjay Kumar of Inferi and Grey Lotus on second guitar. The result is another technical death metal powerhouse that really made waves and made me so happy for Nick. Admittedly, it's a little bit bloated and the bass is a bit too loud in the pretty busy sounding mix, but even so, I listened to this one a lot when it came out and actually picked up a hard copy. I actually forget if I had this one at great or amazing, but I think I had it at amazing. Then we had Creeping Death with Wretched Illusions in 2019. More OSDM worship, more of the same notes I have about all of these bands. Plenty of left-hand path worship with the big reverb. I do love the sound of the drums, and Reese's vocals sound evil as fuck. Again, everything here is super well done, from the performances to the production. I just don't think it quite stacks up to some of the other stuff on this list, frankly. In any case, start to finish banger album, probably even better live. Again, maybe one day I'll do a tier list of just OSDM albums or bands, but for now I'm putting this one at great tier. Inanimate Existence, Liberation Through Hearing in 2012. Another one of our modern wave of big prog and tech. I've always considered this group to be the more kind of artsy and experimental of the bunch, with each album kind of sounding just a little bit different than the last. Plenty of awesome highlight moments right off the bat with Dharmakaya with the killer bass and start-stop sections. Transcendent Absorption is like running a gauntlet on PCP. The Spanish guitar of Paths to Enlightenment giving you a breather before being thrown back into the fray with Morphogenesis. A Myriad of Visions gets more psychedelic and avant-garde. The only things that keep this from rising all the way to the top are the kind of monotone death growls, and overall length. At 16 tracks, it just feels like it's a bit longer than it needs to be, although the last 7 are all instrumentals. Otherwise, really impressive stuff. I'm gonna put this one at fantastic. Next is Ossuarium with Living Tomb in 2019. These guys were actually local to Portland, but unfortunately this was their only full length before they split up. More pretty typical OSDM with that big cavernous sound and some doomy elements. I remember also enjoying their 2017 EP Calcified Trophies of Violence. Not much to say about this one, but it was fun while it lasted. Looks like some of the members have continued on with Somatic Decay and Funeral Relic. I'm gonna put this one at good tier. Then we have the Zenith Passage with Solipsist in 2016. So glad we're finally getting a follow-up 7 years later. Better late than never, I suppose. With 3 former members of the Faceless, this was sure to be another face melter. What I love about this album is that it not only exhibits all the best aspects of the genre, but also does a lot to carve a niche out for itself with little stylistic touches. There's some killer freeform jazz sections, great use of proggy riffs that never sound quite the same, and use of electronic effects. Holographic Principle 2, Convergence, Deuce Deceptor, and the Dissension Consensus are all total shredders without losing sight of the songwriting. Again, I'm going to put this one all the way up at perfection. Next up is Vitriol with To Bathe from the Throat of Cowardice in 2019. I actually saw these guys perform a lot of this album live with Imperial Triumphant the year it came out, and it definitely went hard. They're basically the embodiment of turning the aggression, technicality, and speed knobs all up to 11. Unfortunately, as a result, the recording comes off as kind of muddled. It's just so loud and so dense with everything going on that it just turns into kind of this giant blob of anger.
I'm afraid you're just too darn loud.
Overwhelming is the word that most frequently comes to mind. Still though, I like what they do and I'm really interested to see what they do next. Gonna put this one at great tier. Then we have Sludge with Born of Slime in 2013. I was on the fence about including these guys as well, since I feel like a lot of the instrumentation actually has more to do with bands like Mastodon, but if I'm including Hath and Alkaloid, this isn't so far removed. Plus, whenever the death vocals do come in, it's always a good time. Matt Moss is probably my favorite guest I've ever had on the channel too. If you want to know more about him and this project, you should check out the 2-hour interview we did, including him telling the story of how they ended up making a metal band conceptually centered around the worship of slugs. I think they really hit their stride with 2015's Dim and Slime-Ridden Kingdoms, but there's already plenty of originality to love with this debut. I'm going to put this one at amazing. Then there's Entheos with The Infinite Nothing in 2016. Also was on the fence about including this band as they are kinda sorta technical deathcore, but they really ride the line in such a way with their more complex and progressive performances that it's hard to argue why they are all that different from some of the other bands on this list. In any case, they are a very talented group, which is apparent from the very start with this album. The punctuating clank of the bass amidst the raging drums and guitar on perpetual miscalculations is total gym fuel, as is the driving rhythm of the title track and banger closer. But then you've got those jazzier, kind of meshuggah guitar solos to break up the pace, and effective but sparing use of synth reminding me at times of Animals as Leaders, which makes sense considering that Naveen played drums and did programming for their second album. I'm gonna put this one at fantastic. Then there's The Hudson Horror with Nemesis in 2015. I absolutely had to include this album for a number of reasons. For one, it absolutely kills if you dig stuff like the Black Dahlia Murder, though there are also some riffs that remind me of Arch Enemy, among other things. It was also one of the earlier albums I reviewed for the site and amongst the first interactions I had with a band as a result. And this actually led to a friendship with vocalist Dan Kelly, who wrote a few reviews for the site, allowed me to use What the Moon Brings as intro music, came on the podcast for a few episodes with his various project, and was just an all-around good guy. Unfortunately, Dan passed away this year, and I'll greatly miss the conversations we had about everything from Twin Peaks to our favorite nu metal and metalcore albums from high school. Class act, please be sure to check out this album in his memory. I'm putting it at great tier. And then we're going to close with Warforged and Voice in 2019. Appropriate to have this album close out the list, as it feels very much like a transition album into the 2020s and was one of my top 10 favorite albums of the entire decade. What Adrian and the crew did here is an absolute wonder of progressive songwriting and orchestration that makes the potentially daunting hour and 13-minute runtime just fly by like it's nothing. And over its course, you'll hear allusions to bands on this very list, as well as classics like Opeth. And also very much like Opeth, it conjures so many emotions from pure vitriol to profound grief and sadness. Notably, this is also one of a very small handful of albums that I've ever given a perfect 10 out of 10 score here on the channel, so you know it's going to perfection. Y'all check out this playlist for more death metal rankings, including the 2000s, the 90s, and also by band discography. And again, let me know down in the comments, how would you rank these albums differently? Let's get a conversation going. Like the video if you enjoyed it, but that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.